As of 2018, it had been 10 years since the meltdown of 2008, and for most people, particularly in the US, the worldwide economy had recovered. By May 2018, the official unemployment rate in the US hit 3.9%, which demonstrated a significant improvement over the past decade. And by May 2018, the bull market had not been derailed, and America had become the best investment market and safe haven in the world. However, much of the rest of the world was not booming. Due to globalization and the marginal cost of labor, central banks in the West were able to print trillions of dollars, without generating significant levels of inflation or hyperinflation, and orchestrate the bailout of international banks, major corporations, and the wealthy elites. What we witnessed was the massive power of the global central banking cartel generating the conditions to reinflate the massive credit bubble. The global economy was temporarily rescued from the destructive forces of a great deflationary depression, but this was not the end of the story. After decades of double-digit growth rates, China's economic growth pattern was in the deceleration mode. Japan was still in an intense battle with deflation. Venezuela, one of the major oil producers in the world, had completely collapsed, with hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans fleeing their country. The EU was still struggling with a number of economic issues, from Brexit to major banking problems, particularly in Italy, and with anti-establishment groups, in several countries, seeking to break free of EU domination and Euro restrictions. On the surface, much of this appeared to be manageable, but lurking in the shadows were a host of other issues that were never resolved after the Great Recession, some of which had been building up over a period of decades. The massive debt and credit bubble that started to implode in 2008 is still with us. This book is about that bubble and the associated institutions, elements and instruments that have kept it alive and breathing. The global elite mantra is that it cannot be allowed to burst, for it might mean the end of civilization as we know it and the destruction of an enormous amount of wealth. It is the most massive economic and financial bubble ever devised in recorded history. There has never been anything like it. It took decades to create it. Hopefully, it will not take decades to dismantle the massive destructive deflationary power embedded in its bowels. The main narrative in this publication is that we will be confronted with a future meltdown, economic collapse, greater than the meltdown of 2008. Major factors are converging that will generate a perfect storm. Part 1, Phase I, The Outer Limits, examines the extraordinary events and critical issues of the meltdown of 2008. I agreed with former Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke when he stated that the meltdown of 2008 was the worst economic crisis in history. So an entire section of this book is devoted to examining that meltdown. In Chapter 1, we reflect on some of the key issues and events of the crisis. We examine the issues of America's domestic decline and political gridlock in Washington versus its financial commitments to maintain an international presence and empire. We will also examine the collapse of America's middle class and the era of deleveraging. In Chapter 2, the focus is on President Obama during the 2008 crisis. As president during the first phase of this massive collapse, what did he manage to accomplish and how much support did he receive from the Republican opposition, the banking industry and other critical institutions, such as the Federal Reserve System? In Chapter 3, we take an unconventional look at the subprime mortgage crisis and question why there was no massive bailout for the American homeowner. Trillions of dollars were deployed to rescue the global economy. However, for less than $1 trillion millions of homes could have been saved, and America would have experienced a much stronger recovery. In Chapter 4, our attention will focus on the Federal Reserve System and its enormous power as an independent institution. A historical review of the Fed reveals some eye-opening facts and interesting aspects of this hybrid organization. It is the largest chapter in this book, and for a good reason. In Chapter 5, we take a closer look at the double-digit trillion-dollar rescue operations that were put in place to bail out the top players in the banking industry, the wealthy elites, and major corporations in both America and the EU. It was an incredible display of massive financial power orchestrated by the Fed as the key player in bailing out the developed world. In Chapter 6, our focus will be on derivatives, the ticking time bomb hiding in the shadows of an unregulated over-the-counter, OTC, derivatives industry. We will explore how this problem has grown much worse since the meltdown of 2008. Part 2, Phase 2, End of an Era, provides a detailed analysis of the political and economic issues impacting Japan, the EU, and America during the second phase of this crisis. In Chapter 7, we re-examine the rise and fall of the Japanese bubble economy and its so-called Great Recession. Japan's battle with deflation over a period of decades is a living example of super boom and bust cycle developments. Understanding what has happened in Japan is a very important study analysis and will help us to better understand the fallout of the coming global crisis. Japan is a classic example of the destructive power of deflationary bust cycles. Chapter 8 is a reflection on the European Union and the various problems and issues that have been ongoing since the meltdown of 2008. We examine the sovereign debt crisis and take a close look at the fate of the euro. The European Union, EU, has reached a critical impasse that will either be result in total political and economic union or collapse into economic disunion and political chaos. In Chapter 9, we briefly explore the issues that led to the historic vote in 2016 for the UK to leave the European Union, EU. The Brexit vote was unexpected and raised a lot of questions regarding the future of the EU. We question whether this historic vote will encourage other nations to decide to leave and quit the EU and the euro. In Chapter 10, we swing back across the pond, the Atlantic Ocean, and examine the historic election of Donald Trump as the 45th President of the United States. The primary concerns in this publication are the economic policies President Trump and the Republicans will pursue during the current downward wave. Major missteps and flawed policies, in the premier economy in the world, will prove to be very detrimental and lead to a collapse of the global economy. If America stumbles into the deflationary abyss, it will take the rest of the world with it. Part 3, The Grand Convergence, will examine the thoughts and ideas of three non-mainstream economists who have arrived at similar conclusions regarding the factors leading to periods of economic slowdowns, collapse, and downward waves. This section will also explore the collective force of several enormous factors that are destined to bring about a simultaneous shock to the global economic system. In Chapter 11, we examine long-wave economic cycles to determine whether this theory is still relevant in the modern era. Has the passage of time weakened the K-wave theory? Is it helping to define the current crisis? Chapter 12 takes a look at wealth inequality and why this phenomenon will play a significant role in the next major global meltdown. The supermassive concentration of wealth in the hands of so few people is a significant indicator that is warning us that we are on the eve of a major economic depression. In Chapter 13, the focus is on the super bubble or bubbles that are floating throughout the global economy, any one of which could ignite the next implosion of falling prices and deflation. In Chapter 14, the subject is the enormous buildup of debt and credit, much of which will never be repaid. The global expansion of this mountain of debt will be another trigger in a domino effect that will have a severe impact on international banks, major corporations and entire nations. The focus in Chapter 15 is on the economic ideas of economist Harry Dent. Here we consider the significance of demographic trends and cycles, the massive impact of a baby boom generation and the economic seasons that repeat themselves over decades and centuries. In Chapter 16, we examine the ideas and thesis of economist Richard Duncan. A central focus and analysis will be on his economic theory of creditism. Duncan sets forth the premise that capitalism was replaced by creditism decades ago, and that this is the system that is now in place in the global economy. In the epilogue, I summarize the book's journey and bring into focus the key issues that are critical to understanding our current crisis and what technological, political and economic solutions the world needs to consider as we move forward in the 21st century. As a civilization and global economic system, we have traveled beyond the point where we can painlessly return to a place of safety. Economic and financial purgatory is unavoidable. The author's afterword is a bonus section providing some basic recommendations on steps to consider in preparing for the next major meltdown. In conjunction with Appendix A and Appendix B, this section of the book is focused on investment ideas, strategies, preparation, and planning as well as options to consider as we move forward in the cycle. Observations of the data in Appendix A and B are designed to assist in understanding the actual impact of boom and bust cycles on stock market performance. I'm currently working on another book which will go into greater detail on how to survive and possibly profit from the chaos of a Great Depression. In Appendix C, we take a hard look at the enormous natural disaster that struck Japan in March 2011. Of particular interest in this analysis is the Fukushima nuclear catastrophe that after 7 years was still unresolved. As an economic X factor, an unexpected occurrence and unknown economic factor, Fukushima represents a significant turning point signaling the decline of a global energy vector. The issue of nuclear power is called into question as a very dangerous technology. As an industrial-era technological development, its usefulness in the age of green energy is no longer viable. What we are now about to experience in the West, which will provide the catalyst that will impact the entire world, is a grand collapse of an entire global economic system and the start of the second phase of the meltdown of 2008. As governments and their central bankers struggle to avoid a major collapse in the global system, there is a strong probability that we will witness more frequent boom and bust cycles during the interim periods. It will mean that even during a long downward bear market, periods of boom and bust will continue to occur, just as they did during the Great Depression of the 1930s. These events will begin to happen in much shorter time frames.